Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to do part 3 of our training on basic check-in, check-out. And again, I'm Chris Borgmeyer from Portland State University. So let me take you right to the slides and we can get started. Okay, so as a reminder, you can always go to the webpage, sw-pbis.com, and click on Tier 2 to find all the materials that correspond with this training. So today we're going to pick up where we left off, and today we're going to talk about fading, check-in, check-out, and graduation. So in the previous two videos, we talked about basically all the basics with development of check-in, check-out, from developing your point card to identifying personnel to play the roles of check-in, check-out coordinator and specialist, to training staff on their roles and responsibilities in the program. So today, the last piece to basic check-in, check-out is going to be, what happens after students have been on the program for a while and it's time to make some decisions. So in PBIS fashion, we will always use data to monitor student progress, and check-in, check-out is set up really nicely to provide daily progress monitoring data. So we're going to have some students who will graduate from the program, and so we celebrate their success and bid them well, and gradually fade supports to ease that graduation from the program. And then we may find ways for them to stay connected to the program over time as well. But we want some students to graduate. We want to be able to fade the supports back so that they're performing just like all the other students in the school. And we want to open up some new slots for the next round of students who are going to need some of those supports. Some students are just gonna require that support on a continuing basis. You start to take the supports away, and their behavior starts to suffer. It's more like they just need that continual dose of added support. So some students are just gonna benefit from staying on the program and having that extra adult attention, those extra supports that are provided by check-in, check-out. And then some students are not going to respond to the program, and they're going to need something more, something different. We know check-in, check-out is not a magical panacea for all students. It is a wonderful intervention for a good number of students, but it is not the be-all, end-all for all students. And so there are a number of students who will need some additional, more intensive supports to be successful in schools. And we don't want these kids to be just idling on check-in, check-out, either not meeting their goals or doing poorly. For one, we could be using that slot and those resources for students who might respond. And for another, we really want to respond to the needs that those students have, and check-in, check-out isn't sufficient. We need to elevate or escalate the level of intensity of our supports. So we will begin to talk a little bit about that in the end of the presentation today. So some of the processes we want to set up. We want to set up programs, the opportunity to fade students off of check-in, check-out. We also want to start thinking about what do we do for those kids who need additional supports. And so and then those kids that we need to just maintain and monitor with. So what are the processes and procedures that we have in place for those? And we want to set up some decision rules about how to support these students. So as far as guidelines for fading check-in, check-out, I guess one of the guidelines is probably don't be in a big hurry, and don't be drastic in your fading. Make it a gradual, supportive process. So if we start thinking about decision rules, usually we're not going to consider starting to fade a student off of check-in, check-out until they've had at least 6 weeks of consistent success. And that would mean they're hitting 80% of their points, probably at least 80% of the days on a regular basis. So that would be 4 days a week, over 80% of their points. And then we think about what would be the process. So after we've got 6 weeks of good consistent success, and we want to give the students a chance to really build those habits and develop those habits. And 6 weeks is a guideline that we have for a time frame in which we would hope they're starting to develop and build some of those habits so that we can start fading the program. So then we might do something like transition to a self manager. We might give more responsibility to the students for managing their own behavior. Maybe they're scoring their own points, and some of those things. We just want to hand off responsibility to the students so they can build independence. And at the same time, we want to fade some of the requirements of the teachers and staff and the role that they have to play. After the student is showing they can kind of self-manage their behavior, then we might start fading other components of check-in, check-out. And you can see there's kind of 2 weeks in each of these steps here. And so, we might be looking at 10 weeks of success before we actually graduate a student here. And so fading components of check-in, check-out might mean, maybe we're starting to fade the check-ins in the morning. We're fading the check-outs in the morning. Maybe we're moving from weekly to twice a week or once a week. Maybe we're fading the incentives back over time. You're fading the individual elements again so that you're opening up slots and resources for other students, and we're increasing independence and personal responsibility for the individual student to maintain and monitor their behavior. And then after they've successfully faded through those steps, we could have a graduation ceremony and maybe an alumni club. And some of our schools have set up kind of a monthly alumni club for those students who are have graduated from check-in, check-out, where they get together and say once a month, and they kind of stay connected to the supports in the system, but not on a daily basis like they were initially. So those are some guidelines, and that's just an example of a progression. You could modify that as it would work for your school. But again, the big message is don't remove supports too quickly, and don't remove them without a supportive plan for transitioning the student. So we of course want to use data for decision making, and so in these guidelines, we'd be counting the days, counting the weeks, and seeing. So this student has a really nice steady trajectory. You do notice that the goal is at 75%, but when we hit that 80% threshold, you can see that it looks like about once a week they dip down a little bit. So they're on a good trajectory here to be thinking about fading. Maybe if this was their beginning date, maybe a couple more weeks, and we'd really move into fading the intervention given our decision rules of 6 weeks of consistent success. So, like I mentioned earlier, the goal is always to graduate students. We want to be able to fade supports so the students can self-manage and monitor their own behavior without so much extra intervention and supports from teachers and staff and the program. And so we again want to do that in a progressive fashion. So here's an example of Lucy. Lucy being a self-manager. Say she's been on check-in, check-out for 3.5 months. She's earned 90% of points each week for the last 10 weeks. So based on our decision rule, she seems to be very ripe for fading to self-management, and we maybe could have started a few weeks ago given our decision rules. And that might be especially urgent if we have a backlog of 5 or 6 kids who would benefit from getting on to check in, check out. If we don't, well, then letting her ride for a little bit maybe isn't such a big deal. But in this case, the coordinator would meet with Lucy and provide a rationale for why we would be transitioning to being a self-manager. Might do some training and support with her around, using some examples and non-examples to see that she can score herself accurately as a self-manager, although she's been on the program for 3.5 months, so she may have a lot of that pretty well figured out. But the process might be in the first week, Lucy and her teacher monitor, they both score, and then they maybe compare records, and we want to see that their ratings are agreeing, 90-95% of the time. And the teacher would provide acknowledgement and feedback on the behavior, but also based on the accuracy of Lucy's ratings. And then the second week, maybe we faded even more, and maybe the teacher is just scoring every once in a while, or just checking scores when she's worried about Lucy's behavior, to see that Lucy is scoring herself accurately. So again, we're going to give feedback on behavior, but also looking at the accuracy of the students' self-ratings and self-managing. And when Lucy can monitor independently, now we might start thinking about taking the next step in fading. So the goals, as previously mentioned, we were trying to increase the students' own monitoring their own behavior to take responsibility off the teacher. And when we're in self-manager phase, everything stays the same, except we're transitioning more responsibility for monitoring to the student. And so the expected behaviors would stay the same. The reinforcers would stay the same. The student checks in at the beginning of the day and the end of the day the same amount of times. It's just that the student has more responsibility for monitoring their own card. All right, so after the student is successfully self-monitoring for 2 weeks, then we might start removing some of those other components. So maybe we gradually decrease the number of check-ins during the day. And again, the student has more self responsibility for sort of uh, looking out for themselves. So it might be the case where if they've had a rough morning, they're going to say, "Hey, I really need to check in today." And if they haven't had a rough morning, um, they might decide that they can transition into a school day successfully. And so, and that's something that we would always want the student to do, is if they can self-monitor and self-check that they've had a rough morning and it's going to be a tough transition into school. Hopefully they still feel like they can go to that check-in, check-out specialist, but it's not something that's going to be needed every day. So like we said, you can fade from the daily checkout to every other day, or then to 1 week, and maybe remove the check-in altogether. So just think about how you can remove different components in sort of a systematic fashion. And then after 2 weeks of fading kind of the component parts of check-in, check-out, and the students continuing to maintain success, we might consider graduation. And so graduation would mean there's no more check-in, check-out card. There's no more check-ins at the beginning of the day. There's no more check-outs at the end of the day, except maybe if the student has really had a rough morning and they just need to talk to someone before the school day starts. I mean, that's just good self-advocacy skills, and so we don't want to discourage that, and we don't want to completely, forget about the relationship we have with the student. So, not a bad thing for the check-in specialist to go and seek out the student every once in a while, and allow also for that student to come by and see them. So it's not like we're completely deserting the student. We're just taking some of the formality of the program out of the way, so that we've got, again, opportunities for other students to come aboard. And we'll continue to monitor the student's behavior, just won't be doing it through a check-in, check-out card. And so we will still use discipline referrals, we can still use teacher reports, but the monitoring is going to fade back to being similar to what all the other students experience. And then, as we mentioned, there are a lot of our schools hold a monthly celebration for students who've graduated, and they might celebrate those students who are really maintaining success through a monthly alumni club lunch, or something like that, to again celebrate and provide an opportunity to maintain those relationships. So you can look in the sample check-in, check-out handbook from Owl's Club, or from our other examples there. And you can see we like to have documentation, of course, of what our fading process is. And again, these are going to be guidelines, like our decision rules are guidelines, and still professional judgment will come into play when we're talking about individual students. But it's good to have some documented procedures and guidelines to help increase our efficiency in decision making with students, and to really make sure that we are moving students along if they need more support, if they can start to fade or graduate from the program, and so on. So here's a little fading process checklist, and so you can see kind of this progression. We might have an initial meeting with the student to review data. They might become self-manager. Here they've broken it out into self-manager status 1, status 2, status 3. Or you can see they're progressively being sort of weaned off, as they say, of the program. And then a celebratory meeting, and then a graduation party. And then they've got their alumni club, and you can see that they've got a scheduled 15 minutes at the end of the school day to have some fun activity with the other kids who've graduated. And they've also, at the bottom, this is kind of neat, some of the students who graduate from Check and Connect will have the opportunity to be peer mentors for other students. So this might be especially good for both sets of students, to provide a leadership role for the graduates, and especially for those kids who might respond better to peer attention. All right, so at this point, we've given you all of the sort of basic component pieces for developing and implementing your basic check-in, check-out system. And so our team task here would be specific to the fading and the graduation procedures, alumni club, really developing a plan within your team. So our teams would have work time now. So if you want to take some work time, hit the pause button and go to work on this a little bit while the information is still fresh in your mind. And then oftentimes this is kind of the end of our basic check-in, check-out development. And so this is just a summary page of all the tasks that we've talked about through the course of this training sequence. And the hope and goal is now that our schools will go forth and pilot implementation with 3-4 kids in the remainder of this year so they can work out the kinks, work out some of the bugs, have some success, and kind of develop agreements and commitment with the rest of the staff around hopefully thinking about what's the capacity to build our resources to be able to implement with more kids so we can really have a meaningful impact in our school and increasing the scale of implementation. So that wraps it up for what I usually call basic check-in, check-out, and sometimes I refer to it as vanilla check-in, check-out. It's very consistent, it's very efficient, and it's very generic. So with basic check-in, check-out, we want our schools to have in place those features that we just trained to in a very basic and generic sort of way. So and the reason for that is anytime we make changes to the implementation of our check-in check-out system, it takes minutes, it takes time, and if we're talking about really scaling this up and having 10 to 15 kids in the program, you know, my philosophy is let's start generic because we might be surprised at the number of kids who respond to check-in check-out. Every time we start individualizing goals for a student, you know, how long does that take? 10 minutes, 15 minutes for us to really develop individualized goals. And so we want to become really efficient at our basic check-in check-out implementation. And so I like to kind of jokingly say we'll start with our vanilla check-in check-out, and then if students show us and they have the data that suggests they need something more individualized or tailored to their needs, we're going to take that vanilla check-in check-out and we're going to start adding some flavors. We might add a little strawberry, we might add some chocolate to the student preferences, we might put some sprinkles on top. And so that's what we're going to start talking now with this next step. And so we want to have a progression of check-in, check-out. And so we've started down here at the very base with our basic check-in, check-out. And now kind of this next step up the continuum is going to be tweaking and individualizing check-in, the basic check-in, check-outs, taking our vanilla check-in, check-out and adding some sprinkles or some strawberry or some chocolate to try and tailor it to the individual student's wants, needs, and preferences. So so now we're looking at the data, and we're going to get into like the data teaming process. But in order to kind of move forward with the data teaming process and looking at data for decision making, you want to have some options to use with the students. And so oftentimes we look at the data and we see some kids who are kind of almost there but not quite hitting their goal regularly. So I like to refer to these as those borderline responders. They're these students who might need a little bit of a change, a little modification, or tweak. They might need a tweak to their check-in, check-out implementation. So we might have to take that vanilla check-in, check-out and add a little bit of flavor, some chocolate or some strawberries. And so moving from basic check-in, check-out up to that next level of implementation where we have some tweaks or some small changes to the check-in, check-out implementation. This is where we start to individualize. But in our meetings, I like to have data that shows these students have sort of earned the minutes that we're going to talk about them. So we might have the student on basic check-in, check-out for just 2 weeks, and we say, hey, they're not quite there. Maybe we need to individualize it a little bit. And what we want to do is even make that individualization of check-in, check-out as efficient as we can. So I encourage our teams to develop a range of sort of go-to tweaks that they can have readily available. And so you want to be thinking about what are those things we could do to individualize our check-in, check-out just a little bit to support our students better and to individualize to their individual wants and needs. And so tweaking a plan for a borderline responder, we want that to only take a couple minutes. So we want to be able to look at our students' check-in, check-out data, and without having a super extensive discussion, just reflect on what are some of the students' preferences, what's working in the check-in, check-out system, what we think could work a little bit better. And so we ask our teams to come up with kind of a menu of quick changes or tweaks. And so you can see at the bottom of the page here, maybe the check-in, check-out mentor isn't the best fit. And do we have a kind of a menu of mentors that the student might be able to select from, or people who would be ready and willing to be a mentor if need be? Maybe we need to look at the incentives. So we usually start with these generic incentives with our basic vanilla check-in, check-out. Maybe now it's time to start thinking about individualizing the incentives because the student isn't really responding to those incentives very well. Maybe we individualize the goals for the student. Maybe we've got to change the goals away from the school-wide rules and get a little bit more specific and tailor them to the individual student's needs. And again, thinking about, do we have a point card ready that we could do that quickly? And hopefully we can do that within a couple minutes in our meeting to keep things moving along pretty quickly. Maybe we need to build in more frequent check-ins, more regular check-ins for the student. Maybe wait until the end of the class period for a check-in is too long for the student. And so we need ways to build in more frequent check-ins and feedback for the student to help get them through those periods. If 45 minutes is too long, can we build in some quicker check-ins? And so we'll introduce you to the Hair Club for Kids idea as an adaptation or a tweak of check-in, check-out. And then maybe we reduce the goal temporarily. We don't recommend going lower than 70%. If you're going to have to go lower than 70%, we'd actually probably recommend going up here to individualizing the behaviors of focus and making them more specific. So rather than your big be safe, it might be keep hands and feet to yourself, so that it's a more streamlined focus and less things for the student to be focused on specifically. But again, that would be tailored to the individual student's situation. So we want to have that range of tweaks available so that we can make quick changes, and it's almost like a plug and play model. We can just say, what's the data say? We think this would be a good fit. Let's plug them into this readily available tweak to check in, check out, so we can individualize it a little bit to their needs, and let's run it for a couple more weeks and see how the student responds. So here you can see, looking at Chris Black's data, we see he's got that 80% goal line, and he's just kind of not quite over the hump. And you see we made an intervention change here. Maybe there was a tweak here on November 16th. But the student started off well and now is still kind of just not quite there. Could use an extra boost. And so let's think about what are the available changes or tweaks that we might have that we can hopefully do in 2 minutes or less in a data teaming meeting. And so do you think changing a mentor would be good for Chris Black? Changing up the incentives? Maybe he needs more individualized goals or more frequent check-ins. And so the team would use their professional judgment to figure out which of these tweaks, or maybe a couple of these tweaks, would best serve Chris Black and hopefully get him over the hump with his success. And we can also at this point look at a little bit of our existing check-in, check-out data. So when you get into check-in, check-out Swiss, you get the student count report here, which is kind of just the average per day, the average number of points earned per day on the daily point card. But we can also dig into that a little bit. And we can say, is there by period, what's the average points by period? And so here we can see period 3 seems to be the lowest one, and so we might ask what's going on in period 3, and that might help in tailoring some of the supports or the intervention. Maybe we could even do an incentive specifically for period 3, and if he gets his points in period 3, he'd earn an additional incentive or something to kind of help boost him up. So this is where using data can be really helpful in kind of tailoring how you're going to modify or tweak your check-in, check-out implementation. And here we can just pull up on period 3. We see a lot of low scores here in period 3, so doing a little bit something extra to motivate on period 3 might be a good way to kind of get him over the hump with his overall daily average of points. So again, using a little bit of data that's already there, it's already available. We're just mining the check-in, check-out data, and this is check-in, check-out Swiss. Can generate all these graphs pretty easily for you to take a look at and use in decision making. So again, just being ready to make those quick changes. And so what are the materials that you need? What are the personnel that you need to have ready to change mentors? So do you think about the logistics? So I always want my teams at this point to make a list, make a menu, and almost like a checklist. So when you've got a new student who's a borderline responder, you say, okay, let's go down the list. Which one would work? Check, changing the incentive. Check, changing the mentor. And so we can target those quickly, and hopefully we've got ideas for how to get the incentive set up, or change the individualize the goals quickly, or what are the materials that we need. So for example, in this example point card for Gordon Russell Middle School, the generic point card wouldn't necessarily have this goals line here for individualizing. So this line would probably be missing. And so they would just have the school-wide rules here. And I encourage you to keep your school-wide rules here and just add a column for individualizing your goals. And so here you can see for Robbie, they decided that respect others and property might mean specifically respectfully asking for help. Make safe and responsible choices would be staying in seat, and strive for success is work hard on task. And so these more specific goals are going to be more achievable because they're more focused for Robbie. He can focus in, zone in specifically on those instead of these broad categories of respect others and property, make safe and responsible choices. So again, once the student this is a more intensive implementation. As soon as the student starts achieving those points, we can start fading back to the overall school-wide rules. This is an example of the check-in, check-out hair club for kids. First I heard of this was from one of my friends and past students, Sean Fletcher, so I'll give him credit. And if he didn't get it, well, he deserves credit anyways. He's a great guy. Anyway, you can see how now this would be to increase the frequency of check-ins and feedback. And so this during each period, beginning of the day or reading time or after recess activities, the staff are trained to apply hair to the head of the corresponding face that is so if I walk by and the student's engaging in good behavior during check-in, I'd put a hair for safe, respectful, and responsible as I go by. And then at the end of the period, I can just circle this face that has the most hair on it as an overall estimate of how they're doing for the period. And so again, it gives me a way to, without drastically changing the card or anything like that, it gives me a way to really support and encourage our teachers to go by and give him a little bit more frequent feedback than waiting until the end of that period. So you could also, break this into smaller periods, smaller intervals, but that gets to be a real hassle in terms of redesigning the card and so on. Another thing you could do is you could do a midpoint here if the student needs to have a midday check-in with an adult, or maybe a midday incentive option, because the full day is too long. So you could actually divide the card and put a little midway point line in there where they go and check in, you total the points, and they could earn their incentive and that sort of thing. So again, another way to increase the frequency of check-ins on the sort of the broader check-in realm, like checking in with the adult in the morning, checking in with the adult in the afternoon, and maybe doing a midday check-in for students who might need that extra boost in the middle of the day. So now, again, these are tweaks in your progression towards being increasingly sort of individualized for students who aren't initially responding to the basic vanilla check-in, check-out. So you can see with some of these kids, we might just have to add a little bit of strawberry. With other kids, you maybe just got to throw a couple sprinkles on top. But with some of these kids, we might end up putting some chocolate and some caramel and maybe a little whipped cream on top if they need more intensive. And the more individualized and the more fancy we need to get, we're moving kids up that progression towards more individualized and intensive supports. But we always want to do that incrementally because, and that also has to correspond with identifying kids early and starting early with implementation. And so the whole goal here is get kids started in September, October, and then we can, if after 2 weeks they're not responding, we still got plenty of opportunities to make changes and intensify the supports in the school year, and the teachers should be feeling like, hey, we're doing some things to support them as well. All right, so teamwork time. What tweaks do you want to develop and be ready for with your borderline responders? So think about creating that menu and documenting that and getting that in your handbook, and having that ready as a tool when you are meeting as a team to be able to kind of go through that checklist and identify what sports you want to match with the student. Have your materials adapted, so if you need to create a point card in which you have a column for individualizing goals. Again, it's nice to have that be a generic point card that looks similar to the normal check-in, check-out point card, but it's a template, so I don't have to recreate the template every time. It's a template that we can just pull out quickly. We've got it on file, and we can write those goals in, print it out, and we're ready to go. Do we need to have some additional incentives? Do we need to have some additional check-in, check-out persons? But again, having things all ready to go, how can you pre-plan this so that it's really plug and play and you can keep things moving as efficiently as possible, even though you're going to be doing some tweaks to the intervention. All right, so that wraps things up with this check-in, check-out training video, going from our basic check-in, check-out into some tweaks or some modifications for those borderline responders. We hope to see you in the next videos as we continue up the continuum of supports for Tier 2 interventions for students.